Gerald Ford served in the United States Navy during World War II aboard the aircraft carrier Monterrey in operations in the Gilbert Islands, Bismarck Archipelago, Marshall Islands, Asiatic and Pacific carrier raids, Hollandia, Marianas, Western Carolinas, Western New Guinea, and the Leyte operation. While on the carrier, Ford additionally participated in the liberation of the Philippines and would be discharged in 1946 at the rank of lieutenant commander. Ford would then be a congressman from 1949 to 1973 and be considered the Republican John F. Kennedy, and this was before making Nixon's vice president in 1973, and then he became the president the next year following Nixon's resignation. President Gerald Ford signed the Helsinki Accords in 1975, which were opened up by Richard Nixon, where the U.S. formally acknowledged Soviet dominance in East Germany, and this would cause Ford to have a very significant blunder in the 1976 presidential debates, where he stated that the Soviets didn't have dominance over the rest of Eastern Europe when in fact they did. Things also appeared great for the Soviets and Cubans as they launched many international interventions as they were on their highs. However, the United States did get a promise from the Soviets to uphold human rights as well as the Warsaw Pact countries, which they didn't follow. This would be important in the 1980s as the people living in these repressive states would point to their promise of human rights and demand basic things like freedom and McDonald's. Regarding Vietnam, Congress overwhelmingly voted against sending more aid to the South Vietnamese, and in 1975, President Ford said the war was now over as far as America was concerned. With the North Vietnamese forces advancing to South Vietnam's capital of Saigon, Ford ordered the evacuation of U.S. personnel while also allowing U.S. forces to aid others who wished to escape from the communist advance. 40,000 U.S. citizens and South Vietnamese were evacuated by plane until enemy attacks made further such evacuations impossible. The fall of Saigon is considered one of the biggest foreign policy failures of President Ford's administration as the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong defeated South Vietnam. Operation Frequent Wind was the final phase of the evacuation preceding the fall of Saigon on April 30th, where U.S. military and Air America helicopters took evacuees to offshore U.S. naval vessels. During the operation, so many South Vietnamese helicopters landed on naval vessels, taking the evacuees that some were pushed overboard to make room for more people. Regarding the Laotian Civil War, after the Vietnam War's end and the North Vietnamese authorization of the seizure of power in Laos by communist groups, the Pathet Lao forces on the Plain of Jars, supported by North Vietnamese heavy artillery and other units, began advancing westward in April of 1975. Throughout the summer of that year, the Royal Laotian Army received orders not to resist the Pathet Lao, and the U.S. evacuated their closed embassy in Laos. Additionally, the Hmong people who had aided the U.S. in their civil war faced repression at home from the communist government for their collaboration with the Americans. Tens of thousands would live in exile in Thailand, and most of the Hmong would eventually be resettled in the United States and in other countries. Between 1975 and 1982, 53,700 and other Highlander Laotian refugees were resettled within the United States, and thousands more were sent to other countries to escape Laos. The Cambodian Civil War also came to an end with a communist victory in the Khmer Rouge capture of Phnom Penh. The United States quickly mobilized an airlift of food, fuel, and ammunition into Phnom Penh, but as U.S. support for the Khmer Republic was limited by the Case Church Amendment, the Bird Air Company, under contract for the United States government, controlled the airlift, flying 20 times per day, and on April 12th, the U.S. Marines were deployed in Operation Eagle Pole to successfully evacuate 289 people to safety. In May of 1975, shortly after the fall of Phnom Penh, the Khmer Rouge seized the American merchant ship Mayaguez in international waters, sparking what became known as the Mayaguez Incident. Ford dispatched Marines to rescue the crew, but the Marines landed on the wrong island and met unexpectedly stiff resistance as the sailors were being released. In the operation, 2 helicopters carrying the Marines for the operation were shot down, and 41 U.S. servicemen were killed and 50 others were wounded, while approximately 60 Khmer Rouge soldiers were killed. Despite American losses, the rescue operation resulted in a boost in Gerald Ford's poll numbers and deterred future provocation by other communist countries in the region. Another major issue which faced Ford's administration in the Asia-Pacific region was the axe murder incident on the Korean DMZ at the village of Panmunjom, which was the only place where North and South Korea came into contact with one another. North Korea had been waging a campaign of diplomatic pressure and minor military harassment to try to convince the United States to withdraw from South Korea in 1976 after the U.S. withdrawals in Indochina, and on August 26, 2 American officers were killed while trying to cut down a tree. The Ford administration was determined to not be seen as the paper tiger of Saigon and decided that it was necessary to respond with a major show of force. A large number of American ground troops went to cut down the tree, while at the same time the Air Force deployed flights over Panmunjom. The North Korean government then backed down and allowed for the tree cutting to go ahead, and later issued a major and unprecedented official apology to the United States and South Korea. In the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean, two ongoing major international disputes developed into crises during Ford's presidency. The Cyprus dispute turned into a crisis with the 1974 Turkish invasion of the country, which took place following the Greek-backed 1974 Cypriot coup d'etat. The dispute put the United States in a pretty difficult position as both Greece and Turkey were members of NATO. In mid-August, the Greek government withdrew from NATO's military structure, and Congress voted to end all aid to Turkey. Ford was worried about deteriorating relations with Turkey and Cyprus, so aid continued until the end of 1974 and was fully suspended in February of 1975. In the Middle East, President Ford also achieved the 1975 Sinai Interim Agreement that stated that the conflict between the countries of Israel and Egypt shall not be resolved by military force but through peaceful means. It also called for a full withdrawal in the Sinai and a new UN buffer zone. Thus, the agreement strengthened Israel and Egypt's commitments to abiding by UN Resolution 338 and strengthened diplomatic relations between Israel, Egypt, and the United States. This further set the stage for the Camp David Accords, which would occur under the Carter administration. Turning to Africa, following the 1974 Carnation Revolution in Portugal and their withdrawal from African and Pacific holdings, civil wars erupted. In Angola, for instance, the Soviets and Cubans launched massive military interventions into the country to bring about a communist victory during the Civil War. Meanwhile, the CIA also sent direct aid to anti-communist factions in Angola, and the U.S. Congress really didn't like that, so they cut off aid. But Angola's civil war would continue in subsequent years, so the Soviet role in the war would also hinder détente measures. Congress's role in ending the CIA presence marked the growing power of the legislative branch in foreign affairs. In 1975, Indonesia invaded East Timor in Operation Lotus following the Portuguese withdrawal. For Gerald Ford and his administration, East Timor was a place of little significance and was overshadowed by the U.S.-Indonesian relations. The fall of Saigon in mid-1975 had been a devastating setback for the U.S., leaving Indonesia as the most important ally to the Ford administration in the region. President Ford consequently reasoned that the U.S. national interest had to be on the side of Indonesia despite them being the aggressors. Ford figured that the U.S. needed allies after the fall of Saigon and didn't know too much about Indonesia or how horrible the regime was, and didn't really pay much attention to it. President Ford was also committed to détente policies, which had become more prevalent under the previous Nixon administration. Ford and Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev continued the strategic arms limitation talks, and at the November 1974 Vladivostok summit, at which point the two leaders agreed to a framework of another SALT treaty to follow the previous SALT I treaty in 1972, so things began to even further de-escalate. He would also take another trip to China in 1975 to reinforce Nixon's opening of the country and to make sure that China didn't retreat away from the United States in the Cold War. Also, as a side note, while running in the 1976 U.S. presidential election, Gerald Ford would face two separate assassination attempts in September where the assailant shot and almost killed him. And that is Gerald Ford's major foreign policy actions. Obviously, every decision was made without hindsight and sometimes with incomplete information. But with that, what did you think of President Ford's foreign policy? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.